Hi, I'm Sarah Kianowski, curator of the Collection for Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. I spend most of my time researching works of art and helping to organize and interpret the installation of our permanent collection. But one of my other responsibilities is working with faculty members who'd like to teach with works of art. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of talking with Professor Natasha Parikh and her students, who are studying creativity and imagination through the lens of psychology. One of the works I chose to look at with them was David Smith's Doorway on Wheels, because Smith's working methods reflect the ways that he completely transformed our understanding of what sculpture could be. In this talk, we'll be looking at Doorway on Wheels and then investigating how the work was conceived and created. Under normal circumstances, we'd be walking through the museum courtyard to the large gallery dedicated to post-war abstract art, where we'd see Doorway on Wheels standing alongside paintings by Joan Snyder, Mark Rothko, Frank Stella, and others who represent the flowering of abstract art in the years after World War II. Here's Smith at the Five Spot in 1957, with painters Helen Frankenthaler and Grace Hartigan, and poet and curator Frank O'Hara, among others. Not only is Smith the preeminent abstract sculptor of the mid-20th century, the Harvard Art Museums have the largest museum holdings of work by this artist, thanks to his long-standing friendship with our donor, Lois Orswell. These are just a sampling of Smith's sculptures, drawings, paintings, and prints in our collection. If you look closely, you may see some of them in their developmental phases in the images that follow. Before we get too much further, though, a little bit about David Smith from the artist.
The history of sculpture is all painted. It's only part of the history of sculpture that's not painted.
You mean from the Greeks, or do you mean...
From Egyptians, from very early times. And certainly my own history, my knowledge of art started with Cubism. And in the very great days of Cubism, of early Cubism, there was no difference between in the concept between the sculptural form and the painting of it. They were about equal. You know, it wasn't painted sculpture, and it wasn't sculpture painted. They were just, it was just a natural alliance.
As he explained in his interview with Frank O'Hara, Smith shared the Cubist desire to break down barriers between pictures and sculpture. His introduction to these artists came while he was studying at the Art Students League, and it was there that he learned about Spanish sculptor Julio Gonzalez's use of the welding torch in creating his own work. Smith had had some experience of welding already, having spent a formative college summer in South Bend, Indiana, working at the Studebaker factory as a riveter and spot welder, and his use of industrial tools and materials would become one of his signature innovations. It also wouldn't be the last time he made a living on the factory floor, as an industrial laborer or as an artist, a distinction he might not have been willing to make. In this sculpture, called Flight, you can see that the red arrow points to the half of the sculpture that Smith cast in bronze and finished with a greenish patina, while the blue arrow points to the components made of welded steel, which he later painted brown. I invite you now to spend a minute or two just looking at this view of Doorway on Wheels and thinking about how it might have taken shape. Do you see the central form composed of arcs of metal moving forward? And can you see that doorway opening set at right angles to that central figure? How did Smith take sculpture, a medium that had been dedicated to creating monuments to wealth and power, or to detailed depictions of the human figure, and arrive at this abstract evocation of daily movement? Although he started his career as a sculptor welding in a studio on the Brooklyn waterfront, space he borrowed from some industrial welders, most of Smith's life was spent working at Terminal Ironworks, his home and studio on the shores of Lake George in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. On the former Fox farm in Bolton Landing that he purchased with his first wife, the artist Dorothy Daner, in 1929, Smith built himself 2 studios, one clean for making drawings and prints, and the other dirty, where he could work with tools to weld his sculptures. Until the early 20th century, most sculptors began with drawings, then shaped their figures out of clay or wax before casting them in bronze or carving them in stone or wood, an approach that began to shift only with the dawn of Cubism. Smith made drawings as records, as imagination, as plan, but he didn't make them in the sort of preparatory traditional way. They were really a space for experimenting with images and ideas. Smith's studio was arranged to allow him the creativity of the draftsman, despite the heavy weight of his sculptural components. White rectangles painted on the floor of the space became a ground against which he could compose his sculptures. The white paint helped him to envision the negative space that would be created once the pieces were welded together and hoisted upwards. I hope that you noticed some familiar forms here in the lower right, where the core pieces of Doorway on Wheels are laid out alongside several other sculptures that he was working on at the same time. I like to imagine him moving elements of sculptures around, perhaps heading out to the piles of metal that he kept just outside the studio until he found a use for them. In this way, he could experiment, using trial and error in a medium that was traditionally inflexible once the artist was at the point of working in metal. This method of working also led to another kind of artwork for Smith. The process of welding the sculptures created marks on the floor that inspired him to start creating paintings like these, in which the values are reversed and the solid forms are white, while the negative space of sculpture becomes solid with color. In the interview, Smith spoke about his desire to see painting and sculpture as inextricably linked to one another. And you can see that the sculpture wasn't finished when the welding was complete. Here we see Doorway on Wheels in its raw state. It's over at the left, awaiting the paint that would mark its final appearance. Smith often took time to think about how to finish these works, letting the metal weather, or in the case of some of the works acquired by our donor, Lois Orswell, taking into account whether it was likely to be buffeted by the weather in her garden or protected within the confines of her living room. Smith often moved his sculptures outdoors to the expansive land surrounding his home and studio, where they could frame the landscape, changing with every shift of light or season. Here you can see how the negative space he created on the studio floor becomes a frame for the snowy landscape around it. In this photograph, you can see some of Smith's later works, in which he dispensed with applied color and instead made his sculpture from stainless steel that could reflect the color of the landscape in their modulated, mirrored surfaces. Smith's achievements in sculpture were celebrated around the world in galleries and museums, but they seem most at home, where he filled his fields with his sculptures. Spread out over the landscape, the artist could survey a lifetime of creativity from his terrace as he contemplated his next work. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope that soon I'll be welcoming you to the museum.